Hello, my name is Josie Monahan, and today I'd like to talk about an issue that has existed for a long time in my hometown. Actually, it's more like a lot of different issues that exist here, though truthfully, all of these problems stem from a common source. This source, if you look back into the history of my city, is very clearly a disease of deep-rooted racism and intolerance, which has dictated many of the policies that still shape our town today. I was born in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and I lived there until I was 2 years old, after which my family lived in Toronto, Canada for 5 years. We moved back to Michigan when I was 8 and have lived here ever since. For as long as I'm able to remember, I've heard people refer to Grosse Pointe as the bubble. I never understood this before we moved to Canada, being so young, and it took me a while to fully grasp it, even after we moved back. However, after a few years, this name began to make sense as I got old enough and aware enough to notice the stark differences between Toronto and my real hometown. When I lived in Toronto, my community was multifaceted. Most of my friends were first or second generation immigrants. I heard different languages spoken and formed relationships with people who had backgrounds I never would have otherwise learned about. When I was in Grosse Pointe, pretty much all of the friends I'd ever had came from parents and often grandparents and great-grandparents who'd grown up in the community. Every last name seems recognizable here, and the feeling that it's impossible to lead a unique life or meet anyone new can be smothering. As another barrier to individuality of any kind in Grosse Pointe, the city's population is overwhelmingly non-diverse. Currently, in Wayne County, Michigan, where Grosse Pointe is found, the racial makeup of the population is mostly white, but not by an overwhelming majority. When you look at the racial makeup in Grosse Pointe, however, it's difficult to ignore the shocking disparity. My city is over 91% Caucasian, which truly speaks to the intentional segregation that our town has helped facilitate, given that our statistic is so askew from the average population of our county. As you can probably expect, the discomfort I feel while residing in this town is minuscule when compared to the difficulties of existing in Grosse Pointe as a person of color. Through examining our city's past, which I will be discussing today, it is incredibly plain to see that the history of our town is deeply rooted in racism, intolerance, and a general us versus them mentality, though many Grosse Pointers choose to be blind to that fact. Our community has a problem. Only after finally and truthfully acknowledging our discriminatory and harmful past can we move forward and become better. The issue of racism in Grosse Pointe is not one which necessarily evolved over time or arose from one specific incident. Our community was meticulously designed to be sheltered and exclusive, or, more specifically, white. Originally, the land was occupied by several Native American tribes, including the Mississauga and the Anishinaabe, and was mostly used for hunting, farming, and trading. These farming practices continued into the mid-18th century, but were later reshaped into a ribbon farm system, which better suited the irrigation needs of the invading French and English settlers. In this picture, you can see the comparison between today's layout of Grosse Pointe on the right and how it looked when the ribbon farming system was in place on the left. Quickly, however, this reputation as a farming town faded. With the rise of the population and automotive industry in Detroit, Grosse Pointe became known as a summer resort destination for wealthy City of Detroit residents, establishing which was essentially a wealth requirement for anyone who wanted to live on the land. This status helped to establish the idea that Grosse Pointe was some kind of escape from Detroit, or a more exclusive version of it, and although the majority of Detroit's population was white at the time, when diversity in the city began to grow, the division between the two towns skyrocketed. A perfect illustration of Grosse Pointe's discriminatory practices is the housing point system, which was used to systematically keep people of color and other marginalized groups out of the bubble. At least up until 1965, the Realtors Association of Grosse Pointe used what came to be known as the Grosse Pointe point system. This included hiring an investigator to report on the housing applicant to a group of 3 brokers who assigned numerical points to the person. These brokers would assign points for the candidate's appearance, dress, friends, religion, education, and accent, as well as the extent to which they were Americanized, allowing Grosse Pointers to bar any person from living in their community for virtually any reason. As if numerically ranking new possible homeowners on the basis of vague and subjective qualities like Americanization didn't make it easy enough to maintain the city's status of exclusivity, a specific point value was assigned to non-white candidates based on their race. While the screening process was not required for any people of Northern European ancestry, out of a maximum of 100 points, Polish people had to score 55 to pass, Southern Europeans 65, and Jewish people 85. It was explicitly stated that African American and Asian peoples were not at all eligible for consideration, their disqualification being automatic. With this information, it should be common sense to see that Grosse Point's current population and incredible lack of diversity are a product of these housing policies constructed less than a century ago. It is a fact that, at one point in my town's history, it was in all respects illegal to own a home as a person of African American or Asian descent. Imposing this point system made it almost impossible for anyone who was not Northern European to live in Grosse Pointe. The mentality which allowed these policies to shape my town is still incredibly prevalent today, especially in the parts of the city which are closest to the Detroit border. In this picture, looking from the border of Detroit into Grosse Pointe, you can clearly see on the road where the property switches between the two cities. As the most recent demonstration of this, a collection of decorative farmers market sheds were built directly on the border, along with a traffic roundabout, to further the separation and strengthen the edges of the bubble. These measures have seemingly no purpose but to block the view of Detroit from Grosse Pointe residents who still refuse to acknowledge the crippling disparities between the two sides. And these disparities, let me say, truly should be impossible to ignore. On the side of Grosse Pointe Park, which is one of the small towns encompassed in Grosse Pointe, well-manicured lawns, white picket fences, and charming restaurants pepper your view in every direction. While the neighborhood on the park side has a median household income of about $112,000, it's less than $25,000 on the Detroit side. And this inequality is not hard to see. When looking over the border into Detroit with the broken street lamps and the boarded up windows, it's impossible not to feel complicit. How can it be possible that I grew up with the privilege to be placed in one of the best school systems in my state, have access to pristine public parks with swimming pools and beaches on the lake, and someone my same age who was born less than 2 miles away from me has access to none of these benefits? This question must be answered and understood by every Grosse Pointe resident before we will be able to make any positive change in this community. Our history has been brushed under the rug far too many times for any trace of accountability to be left. I was not taught in school about the segregation of Detroit and Grosse Pointe, or about the discriminatory point system, or about any of the other atrocities which have solidified the structural and institutional racism in our town. If we are to fix this problem as community members, we must take it on as a personal responsibility for every person in our city who has benefited from these discriminatory policies. Promoting accountability in a community where residents are either uninformed or prefer to ignore their privileges is not an easy task. A lot of people in Grosse Pointe either truly don't know the history or they don't want to recognize it as a problem. When these issues are brought up in my town, they're usually dismissed with the implication that this is just the way things are. The important key to making a difference in Grosse Pointe, I believe, is to educate people on exactly why this is the way that things are. I believe that this education, in order to bring about real change, should be implemented in the Grosse Pointe schools beginning as early as 6th grade. If we were taught in school honestly and openly about our city's racist history, and we learned the truth about how Grosse Pointe really came to be this way, there would be much wider-reaching common acknowledgement of the problem. It is the responsibility of the school board to establish a curriculum for students to be taught about the way our town was formed and the lasting consequences of the policies implemented decades ago. This is vital because if people are educated from a young age on the blatant racism that shaped our town back then, As they get older, they will likely be more open to seeing how these policies are still working to create a more divisive, less diverse community in Grosse Pointe even today. After gaining this better understanding of the issue in Grosse Pointe and where it really came from, students will be more likely to take steps towards positive change for equity in our community. The power of students in Grosse Pointe, in my eyes, is immense. If we begin this process of change through education, our community as a whole will shift to a more open acknowledgement of our past and what is necessary in order to remedy it. Through this education, we can begin to raise a generation from Grosse Pointe who is more aware of the deeply problematic history of our hometown and thus more acknowledging of the ways in which the privilege of white Grosse Pointers actually came to be. Another important demographic we must appeal to is the older adults of our town, the people who haven't been in school for years. At all public libraries in Grosse Pointe, there should be an information section specifically dedicated to informing residents about our true history and what must be done to make positive change. In prioritizing this group, it becomes easier to effect immediate change because they are the ones who hold all the influence currently. If we can promote change to both adults who can take action in the present and students who will grow up with a wider understanding of the change that needs to continue to be implemented in the future, I know that real improvements can be executed and they will last. We, as the Grosse Pointers who want to see change, can take steps to influence our school board and community leaders to implement these initiatives for education and historical honesty. Through this acknowledgement and education aimed both at students and adults, we as a whole community can grow to be more receptive to calls for action and change and actually take steps to create a better environment for everyone in our town. This issue affects every resident of Grosse Pointe, even those whose privilege may allow them to ignore it. It is all of our responsibility as community members to take accountability for our town's history, because the knowledge of this perpetuated inequality in our community overshadows every possible benefit of living in Grosse Pointe. Although this generation did not ourselves create policies like the point system, every white person in my town still benefits from its consequences today. Because our grandparents were considered the kind of people who were desirable in Grosse Pointe, we now get to attend well-funded schools, live in a pristine neighborhood, and be blissfully ignorant of the reasons why we reap these benefits. It is long past time to shed this ignorance. In order for Grosse Pointe to truly become a better place for everyone, we must acknowledge our privileges and the corresponding disparities. We must work to create a more equitable environment by combating day by day the racist policies which have shaped our town. This process must begin through education, and it is up to the Grosse Pointe School Board and other community leaders to do what is right. Take steps towards a specific curriculum outlining the injustices in our town's history and their far-reaching consequences, and provide a platform for the information to be communicated to adult community members as well. As the people in our town who want to see change in Grosse Pointe, we can urge our community to take action in these ways. I do not believe that Grosse Pointe is a lost cause. My town was built on discriminatory and atrocious policies, and this fact should never be ignored. However, I believe there are good people in our community. There are people who want change, who recognize the desperate need for it, and are willing to put in the work. If we are able to unite enough to gain a common understanding of the steps that are necessary to move forward, we can shape Grosse Pointe into a better place for everyone to exist, regardless of where you come from. This is our responsibility, all of us, and our work begins now. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast, To My Hometown. I am Josie Monahan, and I hope you have a wonderful day.